Good afternoon. I do hope everyone is doing well today. For this week's discussion, I chose J. Frank Norris, and because I chose him because I knew nothing really about him. After reading the article assigned for this week, I did find him to be a very interesting and intriguing character. And having also learned that he had pastored a church in Dallas and later the First Baptist Church of Fort Worth, and having grew up in the DFW area, I saw this as a chance to learn a little bit more about local history. Norris was an interesting character. He very much was a controversial character for many reasons. He was very much part of the fundamentalist movement, fighting it back against that the modernists, as they were called, those pastors who preached a more liberal interpretation of Scripture. And Norris was just very critical and fought very hard against what he saw as the liberalization, not only of the American church, but also even of American society. Because part of all, he was also part of the controversy surrounding the Scopes trial. And Norris fought back against the evolutionists and the atheists who, and this teaching of evolution in public school. Norris really fought against the idea of the liberalization of the church and of American politics and society. He was also controversial for many other reasons. Controversy also surrounded him as he was part of the murder trial where he was charged with murder and later acquitted of that charge. But he also was known as the Texas Tornado because of his forceful sermons attacking the modernists and the evolutionists of his time. In doing the research and looking through the database, most of the articles that I was finding dealt with the murder trial. But eventually I started coming across more articles that dealt with his fundamentalist faith. And in two of the articles that I chose for this week, both appeared in the New York Times, and they dealt with sermons that he had presented, and where he attacks that either the liberalization of the church or the liberalization of society. In one that is titled "Fosdick: A Bigger Peril Than Darrow," in this sermon, Norris attacks both the modernists within the church and the evolutionists that were outside the church. And he believed, like Fosdick, who was a moderate, who believed that liberal interpretation of Scripture was a bigger threat than an atheist such as Darrow, because Fosdick was within the church, whereas Darrow could only really attack from outside the church. The other article from the New York Times, looks at a sermon in which Norris gave in regards to the falling away of society, that with the liberalization, not just of Scripture, but the liberalization of society as a whole, where actually in the sermon he compares New York and even eventually Los Angeles as modern day Babylons, as you've had this falling away because of liberalization. Both articles were not critical of Norris, nor did they really condone Norris. They just gave what the sermon was about and left, the reader with, his own interpretation. The third article was an obituary out of the Washington Post that, talks about Norris and actually refers to Norris as the stormy Baptist pastor. The obituary was kind of short, but it does give an idea of his fundamentalist beliefs. And it does talk about his attacks on the modernist and liberalization of Scripture and of the country. However, the article did stay away from the controversies such as the murder trial. But all three did give a pretty good idea of who Norris was and his beliefs and the controversies that surrounded him and his attacks on evolutionists and, of course, the modernists and their idea of Scripture. Anyway, thank you very much for your time, and everybody have a great and wonderful day.